story. Both Rob and Loretta, who is now partially retired and helped me plan this. A lot of times, if you've been with me for a while, you know that I do a series called Future Classics. Danny, you remember that? A book that I really liked, and I thought in 30 or 40 years it'll be a real classic. If I'm wrong, try to find me, right? But often, I just picked a really good book. But this two-part series is two award-winning novels, Trust, Last Time, actually impressive award, and this remarkable book, Hamnet. I will tell you that in my many years of doing book and film events, I'm coming up on 3,600 meetings. I don't remember them all. But I do remember that there aren't 10 that I didn't want to go to. There had been bad weather, I've been under the weather, but maybe 8 or 9 times I thought, I don't really care about this book. It's getting dark earlier, it's supposed to snow later, well, I'll go. But mainly, I am exhilarated by going, and for this book especially. You may not love this book the way I do, and if that's the case, leave now and save both a lot of embarrassment. I'm going to give a trigger warning. I never give them in my classes because students are at an academy and they're supposed to be ready for anything. But you're not. So I will say that I'm going to read the last few paragraphs of The Death of Hamnet. And I am sure there are some of you who firsthand, secondhand, nth hand have had the experience of being involved in the death of a young child. I am getting emotional even if I say it. So I want you to know that if that pains you, even though it's literature, I will give you an alert and you can step out. That's not the end of the talk, it's only the end of the first half. So I will say that I was gifted this book, this hardcover book, in the fall of 2020 by a colleague who became a dear friend at Yale. She was one of my deans. She's here this evening, and when she gave me the book, we became friends through working together, but I think we became great friends through a love of several things, family and literature. She has a background in journalism. I am more formally in a literature sort of background. And we're both devoted parents. And I took the book from her and started to read it. It was probably earlier than this time of year, in my car that was parked near the Yale campus. And I had difficulty moving on because it was getting dark and I hadn't realized it. So I drove home and I finished it at home. I think it's one of 3 books that I've read sort of in a continuous setting. And I'm gonna leave it to you to tell me why it's so readable and important. But I will say that my friend Jessie, who's here tonight, was so moved by this book and knowing that there'd be a program tonight. This summer she moved to Guilford. Part of that sentence is true. So if you've been here before, you know I say that you can do a good book discussion by seeking to answer 2 questions and 2 questions only, and they're not simple questions. One is, what is this book about? And the other is, what's it like to read this book? By the first question, I mean, broadly thinking, how many different ways can you come at this book? Many towns in states across the country, Connecticut has had several, one book, one town, one book. We've had it here. The National Endowment for the Arts has had a program of that. And they look for a book that people of all backgrounds, and especially all ages, they want a book that middle schoolers and adults and everyone can sort of come to. And the only way you can do that is to have a book with many avenues in it, as most great books do. And I give the example that I'll give again, that if you were talking about a book discussion on Gone with the Wind, I don't recommend it. It's a deeply racist piece of literature unless you were doing it as a historical document of racism. But if the question came up, what is this book about? You'd expect someone to say, it's about the passing of plantation culture during the Civil War, and you'd be right. But someone in the group might say, I think it's also about the American Depression in the 1930s. And you'd say, wait a minute, it's not set in the 1930s. No, but it's written in the 1930s. And I think we can all agree that if you were one of the readers of this book, of that book when it first came out, and you read Scarlett O'Hara say, I'll never go hungry again, you're gonna think about your circumstances and not hers. And that's how literature works. It's not just about one thing. Literature memorializes the fact that we're constantly comparing things to what they're not. When your middle school, high school, college teachers talked about metaphor and simile, I hope you were taking good notes. It's not just the key to literature. So much of life depends upon understanding something in the context of something else. When you're teaching someone, either formally or informally, you inevitably say, it's like this, it's like that. Someone figured out that something like every 4 minutes of speaking, you use a metaphor or a simile. And so think about not just what this book is about, but the things that it touches on that it's not directly about, in the same way that Gone with the Wind touches on the hunger of the Great Depression. Those people were also experiencing a culture that seemed to be going with the wind. So that's my question. Awful lot of you here. What's this book about? Someday, 8 hands are going to go up at once, but this is not that day. What's this book about? Just loud enough for the whole room.
Love. Love.
Love. She raised her hand. I don't mean that you're out of order. It just means I saw her. Do you want to say more about that?
No.
Okay. It's about love, and that's it. Yes.
Grief.
Louder.
Grief.
Grieving?
Grief.
Grief. Yes, absolutely. The book, Grief, begins at the end of the 17th chapter. The chapters aren't numbered. I know it's a 17th chapter because I counted them. I have a lot of time on my hands. It's 17 chapters of a braided narrative between Hamnet's dilemma. I'm going to be calling him Hamnet a lot. That's my... and the courtship. So that's a braided narrative with the one interruption of chapter 11, which traces the plague, written by her before COVID had hit the news. Remarkable coincidence. She was interested in the bubonic plague. And then the second part, which is not anywhere near half the novel, is one chapter, where the great revelation is that the father, unnamed, no surname, has had the audacity to write a play about the dead son. Yes, very much about grief. Love and grief, yes.
Sacrifice.
You have to talk louder for me.
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice, who sacrificed?
Sacrifice of Hamnet. He
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Hamnet sacrificed for his sister Judith.
Yes, Hamnet has offered to trade himself with death. And you can just imagine a sensitive, loving twin doing that without any, struggle of imagination. This sweet boy, if you know twins, if you've had experience with twins, especially when they're young, there is something supernatural, I'm using that word purposely, because the book is also about the supernaturalism of Agnes, Anne Hathaway in real life, but she was also known as Agnes. There's no record that she had that kind of interest or power. There's not much record about her. For a very long time, there wasn't much of a record about Shakespeare, who is mainly known through property he sold or debts he owed or who was born and who died. There was a book when I was a much younger man called Shakespeare, A Documentary Life. And we have to remember that as a playwright, he was not very revealing personally. Now, everybody puts some of themselves into anything they write or paint or do. I allow that. But he's writing mainly dramatically about other people. Even his sonnet sequence, when he pretends to be writing about I, is a kind of persona. The thing you have to understand about Shakespeare, he is a dramatist through and through. He's thinking about how to make this thing believable outside himself. And he's a great playwright because when he writes a play like a great tragedy like Othello or King Lear, every opposition, Shakespeare's on the side of everybody. Cordelia and Lear and the Fool, that's how you get to be a great playwright. When Tom Stoppard, who's Shakespeare in Love, has the best acting company doing Romeo and Juliet. If those people in the movie, including Ben Affleck and Gwyneth Paltrow, if those people could have done a full version filmed of Romeo and Juliet, I would buy it. It's terrific. But in that play, he says everything turns out all right at the end. No one knows why. It just does. Well, it just does because it's a comedy. And if it's not a comedy, it doesn't turn out all right in the end. And the thing that Tom Stoppard said that I honor him for is he was asked why, of the many kinds of writing he did as a young and older man, why did he choose drama, whether on stage or screenwriting? He said it's the best way that he could contradict himself. And the best advice I can give you when you read Shakespeare, Shakespeare's invested in everybody, which is what makes him great. There are good characters and bad characters in the sense of the motivation, but there's no good characters and bad characters in terms of their substance. Everybody counts. What else is the play about? Yeah?
I think it's about the family sacrifice for the playwright.
That's why I asked that question. It's certainly another aspect. The family in general, the wife in particular, Susanna misses her father very much. The twins have each other as company. But yes, this is a man who not only is away a lot of the time, presumably not an odd thing in Renaissance England, but away a lot of the time. And his wife suspects he's leading a double life, which to some extent he is. And that's a sacrifice that they're making. When the crisis happens at the very beginning of the novel, and the boy is looking for the physician or his mother, his father's not even an issue because his father's away. Yeah. Yes, please, nice and loud.
Unsung women in
Yes.
history.
Yes. How many books could we say are about unsung women? Yes. To its credit, the book is loaded with female names and women who are actually characters. One of the things I think the novel tries to do is give Anne Hathaway a life. Really very, very little is known about her. And I think that one of the things that Maggie O'Farrell has done is create the Latin tutor whose talent, whose magic is playwriting. He is a Latin tutor. He's an intellectual. Some people are intimidated by that fact. You may know that the word glamour and the word grammar are etymologically related, because people who could not read Latin, or who were not literate at all, or who were intimidated by book learning, thought the people who knew how to speak good had a certain kind of power. And don't we really, don't we? No. Glamour is related to grammar. And the idea that to do a spell, look at the word spell, you have to know the right words. Knowing how to spell, get the letters in order, is connected to have the power to be transformative. And in many of Shakespeare's plays, there is a play on the idea that theater is magical. In Midsummer Night's Dream, one of his most popular and frequently staged comedies, there is an equivalence between the spells put on by the fairies, Oberon and Puck and company, the fairy dust magic, the magic of love that transforms you into an idiot or an ass in Bottom's case, and the magic of playwriting, which makes it all possible. So where the father, the tutor, is a magician of language, the mother is a magician of nature. And I credit Maggie Farrell for making that equivalence, that balance, but very much about what about women? Thomas Carlyle, a name most of you probably don't know, was a very famous in his day Victorian historian and essay writer. He was of Scottish background. And he married a woman named Jane Welsh. And John Stuart Mill said of this couple who were friends, it's good they married each other and made only 2 people miserable instead of 4. One of her jobs for her husband was to get up early and tell the garbage collectors to be quiet because her husband writes in the morning. She was brilliant, and she wrote letters that were discovered later. And in one of her letters, she writes to a friend, I too am here. It breaks my heart. I too am here. And some very adept and prescient women got together and collected the letters of women who were not known necessarily the way Jane Bronte or Austen or George Eliot were. And that collection, I hope it's still in print, is called We Too Are Here. It's magnificent to read these letters by, I believe, mainly non-literary women making the argument that I don't want to be erased. And these women have created a book that brings it back. The book has to be 40 or 50 years old. Yes. Yes, thank you for the unsung women. Someone just recommended to me a book by a woman named Haynes called 1,000 Ships, which tells the story of the Iliad from the point of view of all the female, or most of the female characters from the myth. So you not only have Penelope and Andromache and Calliope, but all the more or less minor characters. It's supposed to be a men's story. They're battling, they're sailing. Shuvi claims it for the women who are not even behind the scenes, but in the scenes. Other things the book is about? I can wait. So let's mine a little bit that the tutor is not named. Why is he not named? As I get to my point in a moment. Why does she opt? We all know who he is. Spoiler, it's Shakespeare, okay? My question is, why not name him? Is it just a gimmick? Is it just cute? Take a guess. The worst can happen is you're wrong. Yes, thank you.
To even up the score?
Sorry?
To even up the relationship between, she's trying to give Anne Hathaway a life.
So to give her
So
her
that
due,
yes,
we kind of have to demote him a little.
yes.
Yes, may I extend on that and say he's not Shakespeare yet. I succeeded a man in a position of some importance at Yale, whose name is Joe Gordon, now a friend of mine, retired before me. And I always comforted myself that when I took over his position, I had to remember, well, he wasn't Joe Gordon when he started. He had to grow into Joe Gordon. I get a chance to grow. I think for that reason, to not have him overwhelm her, a lot more attention given to her life than to his. In fact, one of the things that surprises us is that even though they have that very touching scene together, where he talks about grieving the loss of his son and thinking of him, she's convinced that he's inattentive to his family, including his dead son. She's convinced that he's not only leading a double life in London, but that he's living an extravagant life. And she is partly surprised and maybe chastened when she finds out in the latter part of the novel that's not true. But it's also true that if you read Shakespeare every time he was invoked, it would be hard to get that image. We all know what he looks like. And there are very few writers in Western literature who have the kind of resonance of Shakespeare. So that, I think that was a good idea. But can we say a little bit more about Shakespeare in the novel being marginalized, not just to give the women, the family their due, but maybe also to add weight to that surprise at the end? Isn't that a remarkable scene?
Yes.
Where Agnes goes up to the
Yes.
stage, we're told she has her hands,
Yes.
we'll read that last scene, on the stage, as if she's holding something. I think of someone who's sipping tea from a saucer, as if she's taking this in like a meal, or like some kind of sustenance. And of course, she works in the magic of edibles, right? She's not just topical, but edible. So I think it's very much about the transformative power of art. The Latin tutor solves, or at least addresses, his grief in a healing way that has nothing to do with herbs, through the power of language. And just as his son, now dead, has a twin, there's twinning in the way he brings Hamnet back, twinning between him and his son, twinning in the play Hamlet between Papa Hamlet and Hamlet Jr. In fact, I have said before to this group that you could do a good survey of literature looking at only three themes: doubles or doubling, including deception, including intentionally pretending to be someone that you're not, but doubles, ghosts in the sense of the presence of an absence. So if that painting had been up here for decades and was removed, we would see the outline of the brighter paper not discolored below it. And we wouldn't know exactly what was there, but we could be sure by the presence of its absence the vestige of its shadow, that something rectangular is there, and we could guess that it was a mirror or a poster or a painting. Literature is filled not just with actual ghosts, like the ghost of King Hamlet, but with ghosts of the kind I'm talking about. Something that is missing, and in its missing, remind you that it was there. In the novel The Assault, do you know that novel by Harry Mulisch? Excellent novel about the Netherlands and a family at the end of the Second World War. When a young man goes back to see his home, which was one of 4 kind of bungalows, it has been burned down. If you read the novel, you'll find out why. And he's returning many years later, and he sees a house, a gap, 2 other houses, and the narrator says about him, there was a gap like a missing tooth. That gap is the presence of his absent house, a ghost of his house. That's everywhere in literature. And the last one is secrets. Secrets, whether it's the obvious secret that you're being withheld the outcome of the novel as a plot. When David Copperfield says, whether I will be the hero of my life, these pages must show, he knows. He's a novelist, but he's withholding it from us because he wants to give us a reason to read. But most novels, even if they're not detective or mystery novels, have secrets to them. What is the nature of Agnes's power? What is the nature of just what the tutor is doing in London? Remember Susanna in one chapter is imagining that she's paddling on a river? Isn't that extraordinary? We're just told that she's almost 2, and it doesn't tell you one day she did it. She's just doing it. And her family's around, her father walks over the ducks. And then there's a family argument because there's an issue with another baby coming of why the tutor is going to London. Susanna has some of her father's genius. All children imagine. But she's imagining that as he walks, he's knocking into ducks. The writer, it'll come to me later, a famous late Victorian writer said that he knew he had a special power of imagination when he would look in his father's books of butterfly collections and would imagine the butterflies coming to life and flying off the page. Now, I could do that. I'm not that imaginative. I could do that. But he said he also imagined the space they left behind. I wouldn't do that. The power of his imagination of their leaving was so strong that he saw the ghosts of the butterfly. Before the night is over, I'll remember who this person is. If you know the fabulous poet Billy Collins, I think we've done his poems here at one time, he imagines crossing the Atlantic. He is a comic poet, a witty poet who is also very, very wise. And he imagines that as the beach clears on a holiday, he will set off to cross the Atlantic. I remember years ago there was a Thanksgiving special on TV hosted by Steve Martin where he said what are the things he wants to be thankful for, and he said that he wants to be thankful for Portugal, which kept people from, for the Atlantic Ocean, which kept people from Portugal walking into America. So we're all thankful for different things. But he imagines walking across the Atlantic and having to watch out for whale spouts and finally finding a little jetty or reef and resting on it. And then he walks some more and he imagines how the fish below him must be confused by seeing a footprint appear and disappear. That's what makes him a poet. I can imagine walking across the Atlantic. I sound very vain, I know, but I can. But I wouldn't have thought to look at it from the fish's point of view and what the soles of my feet would look like. That's the power that Susanna has. In her real life, she became the keeper, the executor of her father's business, but she somehow has that gene, and it's a throwaway. It's just mentioned to give her some substance before it turns to the family crisis, the family argument. So the book is very much about art, the art of herbal medicine, we'll call it, that kind of magic. She's a kind of shaman. Remember, people have no idea how that gets done. People thought the same thing about physicians. And many people think the same thing about, again, Brahm, open sesame. That if you don't get the words right, the magic doesn't work. Other things that it's about? Yes, please.
I wondered what would have happened if Agnes hadn't urged him to go to London.
Yeah, and why does she? Why does she urge him?
Because he's depressed and not doing anything and not the man that she married.
Yeah, she thinks the marriage and her children have a better chance if he's out of the picture. And before people knew as much about Shakespeare's life as they did, some people, including scholars, thought that he married Anne Hathaway kind of against his will. She was some years older, 8 years older, she was pregnant. Neither of those things would have been unusual in Elizabethan England. Many women, firstborn, are caretakers for younger children. Many of those women are not permitted to be married until they're much older. Being pregnant before being married, I know it's shocking, but it happened all the time. There's no evidence to suggest that he was cold towards his wife. In the last 3 or 4 decades, there has been more discovery of more understanding about Shakespeare's life and more informed speculation about his wife. Germaine Greer wrote a very good book or essay, I can't remember which, called Shakespeare's Wife, and to sort of bring her more into her own. Remember, she's not a shaman in real life, but she's not nobody. Yeah, she sends him off because she thinks she has a better chance of protecting her marriage, and that's another sacrifice, right, when we talk about sacrifices. Yes?
I would say it's about the artist too, about his need to write, his need to create plays. It drove him not just for money. I think he had that need, and that's often the case with someone who is really talented and creative.
Yes, yes, and let me say more. Is my friend Anne from Yale here tonight? She often comes, she's a playwright. Some of you are artists, and you don't need to be confessional about it, but I'll say more than that. An artist not only has to write, I did the book Fun Home, a graphic memoir by Alison Bechdel. I recommend it to you heartily. If you don't like reading graphic novels, get over it. It's a memoir, Fun Home, short for funeral home. It's magnificent. In it, she's constantly, the author, artist, making herself in this life, referring to literary texts and authors. And I did that book up at the Yukon Health Center some years ago. And one of the physician people, medical people, said, she's really a name dropper. I find that very artificial. And I said, her life is suffused with literature. Wallace Stevens, who is Connecticut's own Wallace Stevens, for years, while he wrote his great poetry, he was an insurance salesman in Hartford, Connecticut. He wrote in a notebook, "The natives of the rain are rainy men." Excuse the sexism, but if you're raised in the Amazon rainforest, your literature, your music, your gods are going to be wet. You are going to absorb the culture of your climate. It's a natural thing for a literary person. I want to go back to the point that you made. Well, yes, you. It's not just has to write. He has to solve his grief through writing. Others of us might think that that's an evasion or it's something insipid. Philip Roth, in 1996, I think, wrote a great memoir of his father's final years in dying called Patrimony. Have any of you read it? He wrote a number of great novels. It's the best thing I think he's ever written. And in it, during the time of Philip Roth's life, when he's married to Claire Bloom, he, Philip, and Claire and some company are in their living room, and his father, who is starting to be in the last stages of his life, calls him upstairs, and Philip Roth finds out that his father has soiled himself. I'm being very polite. It's a mess. And the father says, "Please don't tell Claire. It's so embarrassing." And so Philip takes off the pajamas, wraps them up to be laundered outside the home so that Claire won't know because his father has asked that, showers his father, cleans him up, come back to the bathroom, and he has to clean up, let's be frank, the shit. And he says, "Where do I begin?" And he says, it's like starting a new book. And you say to yourself, how many people that you know confronted with that scene, you can all imagine it, would compare it to starting a new book, a person who's a writer. I want to say the power of that is profound. Shakespeare, the Latin tutor, is going to heal himself by bringing Hamnet back in a radically different way. It's very moving. To me, as heartbreaking as the death is, it is exhilarating to think, this is just a theory of hers, this is not fact. That what Shakespeare did is do that inversion in order to make the ghost and the young prince transpose. Very moving. So yes, if you're an artist, you not only have to write, but you use writing to live, to solve problems, to I say to my students, to enact questions, not answer them, but to pose questions. Are we out? We only half an hour. Are we out of the things the book is about? It's about the plague. Have you not been paying attention? It's about the plague. It's about buboes, something which if I knew nothing about, I still wouldn't want. No, buboes, no, I'm sorry, I had a heavy lunch, I'll pass. Buboes, the bubonic plague. It is not only about the plague. In chapter 11, she traces the plague. Is that not a glorious chapter?
Yes.
If you wanted to read or share with a friend one chapter of nonfiction prose that is exhilarating, it's that chapter. When Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet and critic, was lamenting the fact that increased democracy in England, meaning more white men with less money got to vote, let's not kid ourselves. His worry was that if you let the commoners, that is, pretty wealthy, but not lordly wealthy men vote, they wouldn't have the sense to vote for the right thing. They wouldn't have culture because they didn't have breeding, they didn't have land, they didn't go to the great public schools, by which we mean the better schools for public life. And he thought that the answer to the lack of culture was to have people read poetry. That poetry was the new Bible, because intelligent people couldn't believe the myths of the Bible, and that education would be the way that non-gentry would get their status. Otherwise, if you didn't have culture, you'd have anarchy. And the book is called Culture and Anarchy. And one of the things he talks about in that, and in a related work called The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, is a young woman who is infected with something, and who, like Typhoid Mary, is shunned constantly and pushed around the city. This is not the plague, this is the 19th century, until she infects some great number of people, like Typhoid Mary in America, where there was a debate about whether you could imprison her against her will because she was killing people. And he says that the people who looked down on her because they thought of her as a non-person had her consanguinity proven by their infection. They didn't think of her as a human being. You know what? She was, and she got them infected because she was. It's him saying, be careful who you demean, because there's really a connection. One of the things that COVID did, some of you may have had COVID recently. There are members of my family who've had it 3 and 4 times. A number of my book group people the last month have been absent because they have COVID. It's still here. It will be here for a long time. It treats everybody the same. It's like the DMV. And that equalizing was something that was really new to many people. You don't have to be a millionaire. You don't even have to be upper middle class to recognize that when you're sick, when you're threatened by a disease, all bets are off. So one of the things I think the book is about, not writing for a culture of COVID, but writing to people in the 21st century who know about disease and know about infections and plagues, is that that circuitous way that the plague comes to England is remarkable. Remember the glass burner loses 2 of his fingers to a fire? So his hand is a ghost of these 2 fingers. You know when you look at his hand that this is absent. and you know it's absent because of the presence of the other fingers. The novel is loaded with hands. Loaded with hands. From time to time, I look at these summaries of novels that students can buy in order to write their paper. It's only really to give them research material, but I'm always amazed at the things they leave out. There's a quite respectable summary guide that talks about symbols in the novel. They don't mention hands. Remember, she does this to that flesh? It's sex. I mean, he feels naked, and she reads him. Remember Mr. Spock? The Vulcan mind probe? I have a very complicated literary background. She reads his spirit by pinching that flesh. It's almost too painful to bear, but he bears it. He feels naked, and she recognizes things about him that says he has landscape beyond landscape. She falls in love with him through that touch. They become soon after hand-fasted. Hands are everywhere in the novel. On some pages, the word hand occurs 12, 13 times. I have not yet had the time to count all the hands. It's a lot. Maybe one of you over the weekend would like to do a little exercise. But the hand of the fact that his father is a glove maker. The hand that Shakespeare, the Latin tutor, excuse me, I gave it away, writes. The hand that is a betrothing, the intimacy of hands in the family. The idea, even before COVID, that to take someone's hand other than a handshake is a very intimate thing. In the story, A Painful Case in Dubliners by James Joyce, there's a man who falls in friendship with a woman whose name, do any of you know that story? A Painful Case. His name is James Duffy. He is a portrait of what James Joyce feared he would be if he didn't get out of Ireland and all its restrictions. James Duffy meets a woman named Mrs. Sinico, S-I-N-I-C-O, and they become platonic friends because James Duffy is a kind of monk, and he doesn't want intimacy. He believes that it ruins friendships. There can't be any sex because it would ruin the friendship. And one day, this woman, who is married, but in a loveless marriage, takes his hand and puts it up to her face. That's all she does. His hand, her face, and he pulls it away, and he cuts off all connection with her because she's violated the sacredness of their friendship by being intimate. Sometime later, he reads a newspaper article. Is this coming back to anyone?
Yes.
What do you people do with your time? And he sees a story in the newspaper called A Painful Case. A woman inebriated was struck by a train. They don't know if it was accidental. They don't know if it was intentional. They don't know if it was the kind of thing where you get so drunk you don't care if you live. And at the end of it, it says there was an inquest and no blame attached to anyone. No one was at fault. And he reads this and he's horrified because he feels in his refusal of this gesture of tenderness, he sentenced her to death. He walks through the park and he's feeling really bad. Well, he gets over it. He manages to convince himself that it couldn't have been that bad. And I taught this at Trinity College when I was half the age I am now, and a student in class, a male, a student in class, a varsity athlete, said, what is the big deal? I said, what do you mean? And he said, his hand. I said, you don't think that's a big deal? He said, no. And I said to him, can I have your hand? And he gave it to me, and I started to put it up to my cheek, and he pulled it away, and I swear he didn't say, but he thought a very unkind word about men who touch other men. And I said, do you get it now? Yes, I get it. Implicitly, you son of a bitch. He dropped the course. This was early in the course. But it is phenomenally intimate about hands, and the novel is suffused with hands. So that's a lot of, we'll take a few more minutes, but that's a lot of what the book's about. What's it like to read the book? And again, is anyone here for the first time? So for those of you here for the first time, we're recording this, so you'll be on record. I ask that only because if you're running your own book group, you may want to get to the question, did you like this book or not? Typically, people will get to that whether you ask them or not. To me, it's not an interesting question because the answer is not particularly interesting unless they say why. And often people can't. They just say, I really enjoyed it. It's a really good book. I have had book discussions where you hear a lot of it's just really good. It's a really good book. But if you ask what's it like to read this book and recognize that the climate in a Jane Austen novel will never be confused with the climate in a Melville novel, with the climate in a Stephen King novel, that we all know, especially if you've read more than one book by a certain author, we know what the world of Charles Dickens feels like. We know what it's like to read Charles Dickens. And in an actual group I had decades ago, someone said, well, the thing about Dickens is he's very sentimental. He doesn't really have a lot of deep ideas. His characters are kind of caricatures and cartoonish. There's incredible coincidence in the novel. I really hate all that. Someone else in the room said, that's what I love about him. Sentimental, no great ideas, coincidences. If you meet a woman and she's not going to be your wife, she's your sister. Oliver Twist is forced to pick the pocket of a gentleman in London, a city of nearly 1 million people, the largest city, populous city in Europe at the time of the 1840s, and the man whose pocket he picks was a friend of his mother. It's Dickens. So what's it like to read Hamnet? A question you can't get wrong. What was it like for you to read Hamnet? You know, I'm going to be gone in 45 minutes, and you're going to feel so bad. What's it like to read the book?
It's like peeking under the covers.
Just a little louder?
It's like peeking under the covers.
How do you mean?
What? No, like what? Peek under the covers. That which is not known and which you might not assume is yours to know.
Right. I understand the phrase. I'm going to alter a little bit. It's like peeking at the man behind the curtain. Now, it's true, we also see things under the cover of the marriage and the family dynamics and of the children. But the reveal is that this genius, who is monumental and therefore doesn't seem human, is so far removed from us. Even if we are such fans of Shakespeare, we read things about him, which I'm assuming most of us don't. We read his works, but do we actually want to know a lot about Shakespeare? And all of a sudden, we are seeing something that we didn't even know we were missing. Is that fair to say? What else is it like to read? And did you enjoy that, by the way? Did you enjoy that process of seeing behind the curtain, under the covers?
I absolutely read.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yes,
I felt like,
louder for them.
I felt like it became part of the story.
That what became part of the story?
The story, I became part of the story. So
How do you account for that?
I honestly felt that I was there in the room. When
I believe you, but I'm asking, how do you think that happened? What do you think the book did to make that happen?
Must have been the way he wrote it.
Yes.
She wrote it.
Yes, Ray, she wrote it. So, did anyone notice that it's written in the present tense?
But you're there.
I'm going to give you some wisdom.
But
A
you're
boy
there.
is coming down a flight of stairs. That's a single sentence paragraph. The passage is narrow and twists back on itself. He takes each step slowly. There is no one there. It's written in the present tense. 50 years ago, that was really unusual. And then 20th century, 21st century writers got hip to the idea that it's distinctive. It brings you immediately into the scene. The way literature, the way fiction is typically written is what's called the historical present. Anna Karenina came down the stairs. When did she come down? Right now. Then why did you say she came down the stairs? To give you the feel of the distance of art. It's happening right now, but novelists write in what's called the historical present of past, right? You can hear that. Look at most of your 18th, 19th century novels. Everything is he said, she said, he said, she said. Here it's present tense. Why? Because Maggie O'Farrell is wanting to bring you and me into the story. She's trying to do what a dramatist does. She's trying to get rid of the middle person. In a drama, it's immediate. There's nobody saying, unless you count our town and the stage manager kind of except, there's nobody saying, and now let's look at what comes next. There are the people, characters on the stage, and there's you, and there's no middle person. She's trying to do that here. And she's also telling you things about people we never knew existed that are very insightful and intimate, good psychology, good stage setting, but part of the way she pulls you in is she writes in present tense. Now, how many of you didn't notice it was written in present tense? Yeah, I'm not looking to shame anybody. I'm only saying that if you want to be a better reader, and you may not want to, I don't work on commission, that's fine, you may not want to. But if you ask yourself a question like, why is this book so intimate? Why does it pull me in so? You may, in rereading it, or better yet, talking to someone else, say, I felt really drawn into the scene. It's hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Why do you think that well, did you notice that it's present tense? Aha. The kind of thing you can never notice if you're not going to notice it. But somebody else can notice it, like this book is about the Great Depression. We're going to take a break there. It's 12 minutes to 8. Stretch your legs. If you have to do something library-wise, do that. We'll return at 8, and we'll talk about the second part of the book. Thank you.
There's a way you can do it.
And I'll share with you a story on intermission, which is my granddaughter, who is now 4 months and a quarter, which she reminds me of constantly. She went trick-or-treating for the first time this year because when she was 2, there was COVID, and when she was 3, she had the flu and there was rain. So she went for the first time, and she went as a mermaid. And about a month ago, before I knew that, I said to her, I hope it's not raining on Halloween, because if it's cold, you can put on a coat, but rainy Halloweens are really bad. She said, that's right. My nickname is Barkin. I'll tell you another time. So I say to her, oh, by the way, what are you going as? She says, a mermaid. I said, perfect. If it rains, it won't matter. She drops her shoulder and says, it's a costume. I'm not really a mermaid. My costume will get wet. Later on in the week, she's recounting this story to her mother about dealing with Grandpa. She has 2 grandpas. And she says to her mother, channeling her mother's language, it's all so overwhelming. She's not 4.5. It's like something out of a Eugene O'Neill or Tennessee Williams play. So I tell you that to tell you this. This is not a digression. The host of my first book group ever in Westport, called brilliantly by me Westport 1, was a man who told this story once, like me, as sort of filler. Back in the day when his granddaughter was about 4, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, which is considered by many people to be the most viewed movie ever. Because when it's shown as it used to be by appointment on holidays, or if you're a New Yorker and the $1 Million Movie, if you've missed any or all of this movie, we will show it again incessantly. Yes. And there's one of those movies that adults watch with their kids because they like it as adults. So this granddaughter had never seen The Wizard of Oz, and she was at her grandparents' house to see this by appointment when it was being shown on a weekend afternoon. So she watched it. And when it came time to go to bed, some hours later, they put her in the guest room, door open, and in the middle of the night, she woke up screaming. And Grandpa went in, my friend, the book group host, whose name was Ray Armstrong, and wanted to know what was wrong. She had a bad dream. He turns on the light, he gets her water, he comforts her. He says to her, what was the dream? She said, I dreamed I was being chased by the Wicked Witch of the West. So he's rubbing her feet, he tells the story, and says to her, honey, you're a very bright girl. You know there's no such thing as a Wicked Witch of the West. And in the same, yes, Grandpa, but there's such a thing as a dream of the Wicked Witch. Implicitly, schmuck. Now, he told that story for the same reason I'm telling this story. That's brilliant. And years later, at a memorial service for him, I met that granddaughter, grown. She never knew her grandfather told that story. And she didn't remember that she had a bad dream. And I said to her, I'm making you famous all along the shoreline. You've got to know this story. The thing that's great about that is that's why we love literature. A boy dies in this book. He's not a real boy in the book. He's just words on a page. But there's such a thing as the dream, the fiction, the imagination of a boy dying too soon. So again, if this is going to be too upsetting to anyone, leave for 5 minutes and come back. But this is the divide between the first and second part. The second part of the book is only 30% of the text. I'm going to read the last page in a paragraph. Agnes is whispering, please, please, Hamnet, please, don't leave us, don't go. Near the window, Judith is struggling, asking to be placed next to him on the pallet, saying she needs him, she must speak to him, let her go. Eliza holds her, again, all the women's names, saying, there, to her, has no idea what this means. Mary is kneeling at the end of the pallet, holding on to one of his ankles. Susanna is leaning her forehead into the plaster of the wall, her hands over his ears. No father, no Bartholomew, no. John Updike, who I admire more for his prose, nonfiction prose, his essays and reviews and his novels, said, if life's a forest, women are the trees. Women are the trees. All at once he stops shaking and a great soundlessness falls over the room. His body is suddenly motionless, his gaze focused on something far above him. Hamnet, in his place of snow and ice, is lowering himself down to the ground, allowing his knees to fold under him. He is placing first one palm, then the other, onto the crisp, crystalline skin of snow, and how welcoming it feels, how right. It is not too cold, not too hard. He lies down, he presses his cheek to the softness of the snow. The whiteness of it is glaring, jarring to his eyes, so he closes them just for a moment, just enough so he may rest and gather his strength. He's not going to sleep, he's not. He will carry on, but he needs to rest for a moment. He opens his eyes just to reassure himself the world is still there. And then lets them close, just for now. Eliza rocks Judith, tucking the child's head under her chin, and mutters a prayer. Susanna's face is turned towards her brother, her wet cheek on the wall. Mary crosses herself, gripping Agnes's shoulder. Agnes bends forward to touch her lips to his forehead. And there, by the fire, held in the arms of his mother, in the room in which he learned to crawl, to eat, to walk, to speak, Hamnet takes his last breath. He draws it in, he lets it out. Then there is silence, stillness, nothing more. Remarkable the genius of using those simple verbs, the room in which he learned to crawl, to eat, to walk, to speak. He takes his last breath. If we pull back from that extraordinarily intimate, agonizing moment, when he says, then there is silence, stillness, that's the end of Hamlet the play. The end of Hamlet, after all this tempestuous restlessness, to be or not to be, am I going to kill this guy? I'll kill this guy behind the curtain. No, it's the wrong guy. All of that storm and drum, he says to Horatio, report my cause right to the unsatisfied. You're an insider. Tell them what happened. Don't kill yourself in the Roman way. The rest is silence. And knowing Shakespeare almost certainly a pun, the remainder of my life is silence as here. And the rest, the requiem, the repose, is silence. I will finally be free of torment and either or questions. She chooses that image of the death of this Hamnet to end the first part of her, I almost said play, of the novel. And then if we fast forward, you remember again that the couple has had a talk about how they're dealing with the grief, and he's actually more feeling than she gives him credit for. And then, you know, in the second half, he's back in London more often. She gets word that there's a playbill she's starting to learn to read that has her son's name on it, and she is shocked, as Susanna is shocked, that the Latin tutor has written a play about their son. And she decides to go into London to confront him about it. Along the way, she realizes he's not living quite as extravagantly. He was unfaithful. I don't dismiss that, but it's not what she thought. She thought he was living a kind of double life. And she goes in to see what this Hamnet is. And now I'm going to read. We're not done yet, but I want to read in juxtaposition what she sees when she goes. So remember, she's upset, maybe angry, maybe more than angry, at the violation that he's using the death of their son as fodder. I know when you read it, you got it. I'm not talking down to you, but it may be some time ago that you read it, and you may not remember that this journey is one where she is really, really in angst. Hamlet, there on the stage is two people, the young man alive and the father dead. He is both alive and dead. There's that doubling. Her husband has brought him back to life in the only way he can. That's not her talking, that's the narrator talking. That's why it says her husband, I think. And the ghost talks. As the ghost talks, she sees that her husband, in writing this, is taking the role of a ghost. And it is believed that Shakespeare, who acted in his own company often, but they didn't keep good records, did play Hamlet Sr., believed, has changed places with his son. He has taken his son's death and made it his own. He has put himself in death's clutches, resurrecting the boy in his place. Through art, art repairs the absence. Art heals the death. Oh, horrible, most horrible. Hamlet Sr. says this in the beginning of the play when he's telling his son about his own murder by his brother. Murmurs her husband's ghoulish voice, recalling the agony of his death. He has, Agnes sees, done what any father would wish to do, to exchange his child's suffering for his own, to take his place, to offer himself up in his child's stead so the boy might live. None of the women around, no one's weeping for the boy as he dies, no one is trying to comfort him or themselves. It's a completely different scene, could be a world away, in London, in a public theater, in the play, not even the boy given his own name. She will say all this to her husband later after the play has ended, after the final silence has fallen. Now, whether she is thinking that, and that she realizes with a kind of self-awareness that this will come up later, or whether the author, the narrator rather, is saying that, is an open question. You may have an opinion, and I think it can be read either way. After the dead have sprung up to their places in the line of players at the end of the stage. Because it wasn't easy to get dead bodies off a stage in the Globe, because they didn't have a curtain to fall where they could fall and they could pull a body away, because they didn't have scrims, curtains that went transparent or translucent. Often the bodies just lay there and then they got up to take their vows. After her husband and the boy, their hands joined hands, bow and bow, facing into the storm of applause. And of course, applause is getting a hand. After the stage is left deserted, no longer a battlement, no longer a graveyard, no longer a castle, the magic of theater, the magic of imagination. After he has come to find her, forcing his way through the crowds, his face still streaked with traces of paste, his makeup. After he has taken her by the hand and held her against the buckles and leather of his armor. That's a novelist. Not just hugging, but hugging so tight that she can feel the bumps in his outfit, his costume. After they have stood together in the open circle of the playhouse until it was as empty as the sky above it. For now, she is right at the front of the crowd, at the edge of the stage. She is gripping its wooden lip in both hands. I want to say again, she may be holding it like this, but I imagine she's holding the lip like this, as if this thing in front of her is being served on the platter of the stage, and she is being infused by it. An arm's length away, perhaps, too, is Hamlet, her Hamlet, as he might have been had he lived. And the ghost, who has her husband's hands, her husband's beard, who speaks her husband's voice, she stretches out a hand as if to acknowledge them, as if to feel the air between the three of them, as if wishing to pierce the boundary between audience and players, between real life and play. That magical frontier where the real becomes the imagined and the imagined is experienced as the real. Those of you who love theater, who have been involved in theater in any capacity, who write about theater, who love what theater does in its immediacy, understand the power of this for her. The ghost turns his head towards her, so the Latin to her husband, as he prepares to exit the scene. He is looking straight at her, meeting her gaze as he speaks his final words. Remember me. Now here's the remarkable transposition. In the play, Papa Hamlet says that to his son very early, not at the end of the play. The end of the play is silence, as we just remembered. But earlier in the play, the father who worries that his son, who is a scholar, not a man of action, this boy, this student, who is an intellectual, has been given a task to kill a king. He has to avenge the killing of a king by killing a king. But he's not like Macbeth, a warrior. He's not like Othello, a warrior. He's bookish. How does he capture the guilt of the king, the new king Claudius? He adds a scene to a play, and they watch the play. How does he get rid of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? They're dead, by the way. There's a play about it. How does he do that? How does he get rid of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? He realizes that these friends are taking him to England, maybe aware, maybe unaware, that Claudius has written a note saying to his compatriot, the King of England, kill the bearer of this note. No names. And the Claudius has taken the ring of Denmark and embossed it in the wax, so it's now official. Hamlet finds that note on board the ship because he says to Horatio when he comes back, in my heart there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep. That's the heart of Shakespearean tragedy. The trouble is not just out there. The trouble is in here. Harold Bloom said that Shakespeare invented the modern personality by giving his characters interior lives. Every one of Shakespeare's tragic heroes has a conflict inside of them. In the old version of the guy who has to avenge a terrible murder, the plot was even had a name, the virtuous avenger delayed. Hamlet. In the old versions of the plays, before Shakespeare, they were delayed by stuff out there. Hamlet's delayed by Hamlet. So when the father is leaving, he says to this son who he is not sure, how does he get rid of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? He finds a note, he turns it over, and he writes on the outside to address it, and reseals it with his father's ring, which he got after his father died. And he sends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern off with this note. He escapes, and they put him to death. And when he tells this to Horatio, Horatio says, oh, what a king is this? Like, all of a sudden you become murderous. He's killed two wrong people. Earlier, the reason he's being sent to London is he killed Polonius, who is hiding behind a curtain, because Hamlet thought that was Claudius. He can kill people fine if he doesn't look at them. He kills Claudius in a phony attack. They're fencing, and then he realizes it's for real. So Hamlet is a scholar. He writes Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to death. He writes a section of the play to capture the conscience of the king. So why shouldn't his father be suspicious that he won't do it? So his father said to him several times, adieu, adieu, remember me. Don't forget what you're supposed to do. She, Maggie O'Farrell, in her audacity and brilliance, makes that the closing line of the play, as if to say, husband to wife, remember what I do and what I've just done. remember him, the other version of me, and don't ever doubt that I remembered him. Unlike the father in the play who doubts that his son will actually remember him. He does, it just takes 5 long acts. I mean, the thing about Hamlet is, in the Olivier version from the 40s, it says very sonorously at the beginning of the play, this is a tragedy of a man who cannot make up his mind. That's not it. Hamlet acts rashly constantly. He sends 3 people to death, he jumps into Ophelia's grave, he offers to fight with Laertes. He is a man of action and inaction simultaneously, to be or not to be, this and that. In my heart, there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep. There is an extraordinary brilliance in her use of the play to have the death of Hamnet, use the language of the very end of the play. He's now out of it until he's returned. And the playwright, father king, ghost, dead man, says effectively to his wife, remember this. And now, there's a dramatic version. I'm told, did the person who, yes, do you want to say something about your experience seeing it?
We saw the Royal Shakespeare Hamnet in London last week, and it was spectacular. It's not, I don't think it's an easy book to turn into a play. It had one set, very minimal, so anything that happened in London kind of came in front of the set. 2 ladders going up to a second floor that people are running up and down. A wonderful use of very simple clothes, and when Agnes is pregnant, she goes through these births. Somebody hands her a white bundle, and she slips it under her dress so that she's pregnant. And she goes through labor with lots of sounds, but you know, it's not graphic. And out of the side comes a person walking very slowly with the bundle, which is the baby, and hands it to her for baby number 1. And then 2 people come out for baby number 2 and number 3. It's almost a pantomime, but the actors were fabulous. The stage was perfect. I hope it comes to the stage.
And I'm sure it will. And you may remember that the scene in the play Hamlet, where the killing of a king, the murder of Gonzago, a generic play, that's done in pantomime. That's done without language, as this king pours a lethal potion into the ear of his brother, a sleeping king. And Claudius, no dolt, reads between the lines and realizes the jig is up and asks for the lights to be turned on. But we have about 10 more minutes, and it's possible that the excellent questions I put to you didn't touch on all the things you wanted to say. So is there something you want to add or ask about this future classic? Yes, future classic, you heard it. This magnificent novel. Yes.
Why do you think there's such an interest in Anne Hathaway at this point? I mean, there's Aunt Juliet on Broadway right now. This book is very popular. Why all of a sudden?
All of a sudden?
Or maybe not, it's all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just aware of it all of a sudden.
You mean her in particular, or
Yes.
women who are unknown?
Her in particular.
Well, I'm not sure that there's a sudden outcropping of interest all at once about her. I will go back to the unsung women. It's way overdue. Madeline Miller wrote Circe, which gave human form to a character who is often invoked and maligned, and she becomes a human being. What do we know about her? She's a prop in the story about men. What do we know about Helen of Troy? She's the face, says Dr. Faustus Marlowe, that launched 1,000 ships. That's the end of it. In this book, a few years old now, called 1,000 Ships, That author, I don't remember her first name, you can help me out, Haynes, she's written other books, gives a female perspective. When you say that, it sounds like you're talking about The View. It gives a human perspective by women of a battle, an epic that is decidedly filled with testosterone. I think that's a long kind of history. And I think good writers, especially either women or writers who are inclined to think about women as actual human beings, have an interest in trying to imagine who these people were. I taught a course for many years in libraries called Imagined Women, in which I could put in Mrs. Dalloway, Jane Eyre, Hedda Gabler, on and on. I tried to do as many titles that had women's name in them. And the librarian, who was not a librarian in terms of books and reading, but a kind of events planner, said to me, why are you calling them imagined women? I don't understand. I'm not mocking her at all. I said, because they don't exist. And yet people who encounter these women, Lily Bart, House of Mirth, Jane Austen's heroines, Emma, we respond to them the way we respond to people that we know, because that's the magic of art. They're imagined women. And what the course tried to do is say, our natural instinct is to think of them like women, to talk about them the way we might talk about a friend or a next door neighbor. You're supposed to do that. You're supposed to experience them as people, rediscovering who this opaque Anne Hathaway is. My students are terrible at that because they've been trained to think of them as topics for term papers. I'm not mocking them. I know you laugh, but there's a poignancy in the fact that they get rewarded for knowing that Jane Eyre is not a real woman. She is a version of X, Y, and Z. And they write papers about foreshadowing and irony and metaphor, and they get rewarded for them. God bless them. But at the age of 18 or 22, they're not prepared to say, Jane Eyre's life is miserable. There's a poignancy in Hedda Gabler. There's a poignancy in A Painful Case, that story, that you have to be older to appreciate. So what the Imagined Women series does was say, let's do what's easy to do. Think of these women as women and talk about them as real people. That's the great glory of art. If someone says to you when you're crying at the death of somebody, it's only a movie, the right thing to say is shut up. Right? It has all the power of life. But because you're in my class, because you're in a class where I want you to be better readers, we're then going to talk about how do they get imagined? What makes these characters not real, but artificial in the best sense? So, Madame Bovary, we were talking about, where'd my friend go? Is she gone?
Yeah,
Oh, you moved,
yeah,
okay.
Yes.
Madame Bovary has a scene early on. You know that novel. If you don't know that novel, read the novel. She is being visited for the second time by Charles Bovary, a widower. His name in French would translate to cow-like, bovine, Bovary, not hopeful. And he's courting her. She's a farmer's daughter. Her mother is dead. She has aspirations for a high life. Doesn't look like it's going to happen. And Charles comes by the country farmhouse to court her. And the narration says that in the country way, she offered him a drink of liqueur. And she took out, the small glasses. She poured him a full, tiny glass, and she poured herself just a drop. And he sips it to be polite, and she picks it up in a ladylike way, turns it upside down, and sticks out her tongue to lick every drop out of the bottom, which is now the top of the glass. It's like an 8-sentence paragraph early in the novel. And I say to my students, what are we supposed to take from that? And it says that as she leaned back, he could see the perspiration on her neck. And one of my students said once, I'm not mocking any of these people. I love people who guess. It fills the space, it gives us something to try. Is she flirting with him by showing her neck? Well, this is kind of the equivalent of like licking your fingers. It's hardly ladylike. Why does she do it? because the part of her that wants to be a lady knows that you're not supposed to pour yourself a big drink. So she pours herself a little drink. And then the part of her that likes stuff acts unladylike in swallowing the last drop. In that scene is the entire tragedy of Madame Bovary, who wants more, but doesn't want to seem like she wants more. That's the imagination part. That's the part that is not your next door neighbor. That's the part that Flaubert in his genius added to say, this is her tragedy, maybe 50 pages into the novel. Lily Bard, the extraordinary tragic hero of House of Mirth, one of my favorite books, one of my favorite characters. She has a drab and shabby existence. That is to say, she doesn't have money, but she lives with money. And so she doesn't live in filth, she lives in shabbiness. You know, last year's dress, a tablecloth that's a little frayed, you know what I mean? Just enough off. And she wants to be happy. She's in love with a man named Selden. He's in love with her. And both of them are too cowardly to get married because they don't have money. And money is the name of the game in Henry James and in Edith Wharton. And a character says about her, maybe a third of the way through the novel, you know what her problem is? She despises the things she has to compete for. That's it. Single sentence. She has to play this game because she has no choice as a woman, but she hates it. And because she hates it, she can't commit to it. She turns down one man. She makes a very foolish mistake with money because she's caught in a world where she can't have her cake and eat it too. That's the story of Hedda Gabler. That's the story of Anna Karenina. That's the story of a lot of women. Now, she's not a literary character. I'm going back to your question about Anne Hathaway. But she could have just as well be, for all that we know about her. She's a kind of invisible character. And one of the great things about literature is there's no end to making things new again, to coming back and writing a version of a boy we didn't know about, where his identity is going to be revealed when this quill gets done with its writing. I have endless respect for graphic artists who capture the essence of the book. I was once in a airport and saw that there was, in one of those carousel paperback books, a paperback copy of The Scarlet Letter, where Hester Prynne was a blonde, and she had one of those off-the-shoulder elastic tops that showed her breast. No one realized it's a Puritan novel, and the darkness of her hair is more lucky. I can only solve one problem at a time. Thank you for attending and for your attention. Have a great Thanksgiving. Stay healthy. Stay healthy. Read every book I mentioned.
Yeah.